Thank you for joining us today for Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our Webinar Wednesday program, live from Washington, D.C. We're uncovering each part of the DFARS, or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. As you know, the DFARS are the rulebooks for contracting with the Defense Department, and we are moving sequentially, starting with DFARS Part 201 in January and finishing with Part 253 in December. Our webinars are every Wednesday and are provided complimentary. They are recorded and can be downloaded from our website and YouTube channel, which now holds over 450 of our government contracting webinars. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, so if you do have questions for our speaker, we will have his information on the last slide of the presentation today. And a special thanks to our educational sponsor, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, for making these webinars possible. The NVSBC is the largest nonprofit trade association for veterans. Please visit their website for more information. Virginia PTAC at GMU offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the link provided to explore what PTACs can offer. Set Aside Alert provides up-to-date news, information, and opportunities for small business federal contractors. Their daily opportunities alerts assure you won't miss important sources sought in solicitation announcements, providing details so you can jump on the hot ones. Every 2 weeks, they deliver concise breaking news, events, regulations, and teaming opportunities. Please join the Reston Chamber of Commerce Government Contractors Council for regular meetings. Also, please stay tuned for more information on their very popular B2G conference in May. Please contact Alicia Fields with the email shown on the screen if you have any questions. Federal contracting is a relationship game. Now, get in front of your federal humans sooner with the exclusive Players and Layers method from Judy Bratt and Summit Insight. Connect with her on LinkedIn and find out more, or visit growfedbiz.com today. Join Washington Technology on February 19th, this Friday, as Air Force leaders share the technologies and priorities they are pursuing for the next year to 18 months and what that means for government contractors. Hear where the dollars are flowing and what companies are capturing those dollars. Don't miss out on this critical information. If you are interested in selling to the federal government, you may need a contract vehicle. The most popular one is the GSA schedule. Learn more about the requirements, the proposal process, and how this contract vehicle may or may not be the right tool for you. Jennifer Schaus is teaching a series of several classes, as you can see here with the Virginia PTAC and Mary Washington University. All classes are listed on our website under the events section with the registration links. Okay, and now a little bit about us. We work with U.S. federal government contractors, including product, service, and software firms. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. More information can be found on our website. We also have opportunities for your organization to advertise in our newsletter. We now reach over 23,000 subscribers, and this includes both contractors and government. Contact us for pricing information with the email shown on your screen. And these are our hot topic events that will be happening on March 4th. And please visit our website for more information with registration link. I also wanted to inform you of a new series in 2021. We have launched a monthly series called the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. This is a live webinar series held each month. These will take place on the second Friday of each month in 2021 at 12 p.m. Eastern. We have assembled a group of 4 panelists who are subject matter experts on a specific federal contracting topic. The panelists will make a short presentation about the topics listed here on your screen, and then we'll answer your live questions. So for example, our panelists covered OTA last week, and next month on March 12th, our panelists will be covering bid protests. Our panelists include attorneys, consultants, and other industry professionals, and you can sign up on our website under the Q&A Cafe tab. Sponsorships are available, and please email hello@jenniferschaus.com for a media kit with pricing details. Also note you can use code DFARS for a $15 discount on these live Q&A Cafe series. Okay, and now to introduce our speaker, Alan Apple. Welcome, Alan. We are glad to have you here with us today, and I'll now turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Hunter. My name's Alan Apple. I'm a partner at the law firm of Ward & Berry with offices in Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas today, frigid Austin, Texas, unfortunately, but I focus my practice on federal government contracting and have over 15 years of experience both as a government attorney and a private attorney. And what we're going to talk about today is acquisition planning. Of course, how the DoD goes about deciding how to acquire a good and service is important. A well-planned acquisition can help get the DoD mission essential material to the warfighter in the most efficient and cost-effective way. But on the other hand, I look at it as well as a well-planned acquisition can help businesses who want to win contracts for mission essential material by giving them plenty of well-defined notice for requirements so they can prepare. So I like to look at acquisition planning more as a win-win situation for everybody involved. In this presentation, what I thought we'd do is provide some clarity on how the DoD conducts acquisition planning. And it should help companies better understand how the DoD is looking at acquisitions and proceeding in acquiring the good or service they need to address whatever need that they have. Chad, I guess the bottom line is that we want at Ward & Berry want to be there for you to be part of your success, and the way that we're doing that today is hopefully helping you understand how the government works through their acquisitions and how they view it. Next slide. I'm sorry, back one slide, please. In many ways, I thought the DoD and its components are professional planners. I mean, they plan for everything. My background is with the Navy and the Army, and I can certainly I can testify that they plan for everything. They plan for war, peace, security operations, meals, exercise. They have planning sessions to have planning sessions, and so acquisition planning is no different. It's absolutely critical in the larger part of a mission planning scenario to make sure that they have spent only the money that they have to acquire the goods and services to have their mission success. But there's a lot that goes into it. Next slide. I thought it'd be a good idea to start by mentioning that the presentation I'm giving today is about the Defense Acquisition Regulation Supplement, Part 207, and that is part of a layered approach that the federal government has in acquisitions. And so that being said, you almost can't talk about the DoD Supplement, Part 207, without talking about the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So this graphic that you have in front of you shows you kind of like the front cover of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which gives overall guidance to all government activities. And then the focal point of our presentation is on the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. And then you see to the right there are 3 examples of service supplements that give even more information on how it is that they specifically want to approach the method by which they acquire things. And so, though we're talking about the DFARS, you really can't talk about it in isolation without kind of an understanding of there's more information at the FAR level and also at the service level. So, next slide. That being said, what I wanted to do was transition to the FAR to talk about the overall policy for acquisition planning and acquisitions, where it says in FAR section 7.102 that you should conduct market research and planning for all acquisitions to consider things like commercial items, whether or not to pursue those, in some certain circumstances, or whether or not, or how to maximize full and open competition, or determining what's the appropriate contract type for the good or service that you're providing. Or it could be that you want to not deal with any of those things in particular, but consider using pre-existing contracts. The federal government is a very large place with several different agencies. It is certainly possible to use contracts that other agencies have. And so what they want you to do, they being the government, by FAR Part 7, is think about using all the weapons within your arsenal to be able to acquire the good or service that the Department of Defense needs on time and on target for their ultimate mission success. Next slide. That being said, one of the big questions that a lot of folks ask is, when it should begin, right? It should begin as early as possible, in my view. The reason why you do that is because you're trying to get the government the most effective, economical, and timely solution to whatever problem that they have, and it takes time to be able to do that. And so if you're an agency and you know that a requirement is coming and it's regular and reoccurring, it's easy to kind of plan for those. For some of those short-term efforts that they have, or unfortunately, sometimes emergencies, it's very difficult to do because you have short suspenses or it's complex enough to complicate and slow down the planning process. But no matter what the requirement is, there is no doubt that there has to be planning on the front end to make all the components within the DoD or within that contracting activity to produce whatever it is, the good or service that the requiring activity needs. And so it's a pretty difficult process, and so you have to kind of start as early as possible. And so let's transition from FAR Part 7 policy to talk about the various subparts in FAR Part 7 and then how the DFARS supports that. Next slide. So FAR Part 7 has 5 subparts that deals with acquisition plans, equipment, lease and purchasing, contractor versus government performance, inherently governmental functions, and planning for the purchase of supplies and economic qualities. And so that's the baseline that everybody has to follow. Now, the DFARS, the DoD Supplement 207, deals with this, but it provides additional information. So you'll notice when you see the table of contents for the DFARS that they don't really address within the DFARS planning for the purchases of economic quantities as they discuss in FAR Subpart 7.2. They actually add another section where they talk about buying additional quantities of items, and they give some guidance on that. So it's a little bit different, but that's how the DFARS work, right? It supplements the federal acquisition regulation and hopefully provides more information and maybe some more requirements for the Department of Defense and their entities to be able to utilize. And so let's turn from this kind of foundational piece of information to talk more specifically about the DoD Supplement Part 207. Next slide. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the DoD Supplement, DFARS Part 207, has 5 subparts. And though there's 5, you'll notice the one on the bottom is a little bit different than the FAR listing that you had before, because there's a little bit more guidance on other things, buying additional quantities of end items. Whenever the DoD has a specific statutory authority to buy things, sometimes they'll put down a quantity and an appropriated amount, a dollar amount. And so that's some authority to be able to buy more quantities under certain circumstances, even as long as they stay on that appropriated amount. And so just more guidance that the DoD would have. And it makes a lot of sense to do that, because the DoD is, one of the more well-funded agencies that the government has, and they're going to spend a lot of money and do a lot of good things for the country for sure. But what I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about each one of these, kind of give some context for anybody that might be listening that aren't that familiar with these sort of terms, and then kind of address each one of them as we go through. And so acquisition plans, of course, and DFARS Subpart 207.1 is all about the process by which the DFARS directs agencies to conduct acquisition planning. It adds to another layer of information that either the DoD activity has to give, or certain things they have to do or consider, certainly, but it can include things like considering compatibility with future systems and programs, or things like that, or milestones, when milestone decisions have to be made, or things as simple as what kind of contract type that you have to deal with, and things of that nature. And so it goes from the simple to the very complex, but and we'll talk about that in more detail as we go forward, but certainly that substance is there in the DFARS. And so one thing that's kind of interesting about this whole section is, even though it seems like a lot of information, really in hard copy, I think in my hard copy, the DFAR Part 207 is really only about 7 pages. Now, it's small print and all that sort of stuff, but it's not necessarily that long. It's just content heavy, right? So Subpart 207.3, Contractor versus Government Performance, is all about the policy outlined in the Office of Management and Budget Circular A76. You've probably heard of A76 in passing in some way, where it talks about public and private competitions or studies to determine whether or not it's more cost efficient or better for government employees to do something rather than contractors, and the prohibitions that are involved therein. Subpart 207.4 is about equipment leasing or purchasing, and requirement to do some sort of cost benefit analysis as to which one's better for a particular circumstance if you're going to lease for over 60 days. And the DFARS Subpart 207.5 talks about inherently governmental functions. And so probably we've all been afflicted by having to do some sort of analysis on inherently governmental functions at some point in time. But if you haven't, you should know that these are functions that are so intimately related to the public interest, as it mandates that the government should perform that thing, that activity. And so certainly there's some limitations in there. You'll notice that the theme with all these, even though some of the topic titles may be a little bit counterintuitive, is they all have to do with how an activity might plan for an acquisition, and some of the issues that would be embedded within it. Whether you're talking about manning and personnel, or the equipment that you're going to utilize, or whatever. And so that's the theme of the entire DFARS subpart. Next slide. And so the first question that most people ask, when you're talking about acquisition planning, certainly is, whether or not it has to be in writing or not, because in writing connotes like a longer report and more detailed and all that sort of thing. Certainly it is, and there's guidance in the DFARS as far as when it is you have to do a written acquisition plan. And so for those things, those acquisition programs, and estimated at $10 million or more, certainly you're required by the DFARS to do a written acquisition plan. Or when the total cost of contracts of an acquisition program is estimated at $50 million or more, that's another threshold that would require it. Or if one particular year was $25 million or more. And so you have these kind of dollar amount thresholds that would push you over to require a written acquisition plan. And you also have direction by the department. If you have somebody within the department that wants your activity that's going out to acquire the thing to do an acquisition plan, certainly it can be directed by policy or otherwise. And so those are the things that would trigger the written acquisition plan. Next slide. You might ask, so if I do a written acquisition plan, what's in it? And so that's always the next logical question for me. Anyway, so the DFAR 207, what we're focusing on today, talks about, in addition to the FAR Part 7 requirements, they also have several different special items that are in and they refer you to PGI 207.105. And so PGI is short for Procedures, Guidance, and Instructions, and they are further elaborating instructions on, how to implement a FAR part or DFAR part. And so here you have PGI 207.105 that kind of gives more clarification on how FAR Part 7 requires you to develop your acquisition plan. And so what is the acquisition plan? Well, in my opinion, it's a lot of information. And so as you can imagine, depending on how complex the requirement is or how simple the requirement is, it will kind of regulate as to how much that lot of information is. But it's always detail oriented and impactful of information. Certainly that, depending on the technical nature of the requirement and also the circumstances and the stage of the acquisition, it could make it more complex than would otherwise be required. But that being said, the actual written acquisition plan is really kind of divided up into two large components or two major sections, right? An acquisition background and objectives and a plan of action. The acquisition background and objectives by the FAR Part 7 has basically 8 components that it talks about. And so it talks about the requirement for having some sort of statement of need or applicable conditions that relate to that need, or the cost or capability or performance and performance standards. And so there's a lot of detail that would go into those sort of things, but it gives a lot of information on certain detailed aspects of the acquisition. And like I said, this particular section has about 8 different components or subsections that you would have to address in a written acquisition plan. The second phase of the acquisition plan, the plan of action, has actually 22 components or subsections, depending on how you want to look at it. They cover everything from potential sources that you have there, how you're going to maximize competition, contract type and selection, what your social selection procedures are going to be, and things like that would have to be, of course, in writing in a certain section that would be within this acquisition plan. There's another section within the plan of action that has, it's very generic, says other considerations, which we'll talk about more in detail in a little bit, but certainly it is, pretty much everything else that is relevant and should be considered in the acquisition of whatever it is that the agency is requiring. So that being said, the DFARS adds DoD related requirements to the written plan. And so all these things that I've been talking about that are within FAR Part 7, they are built upon by the DFARS Part 207. Okay. Next slide. And so within those two sections and areas within the acquisition plan, the acquisition background and objectives, and the plan of action, you have certain things that are outlined within the PGI, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, that are there. So for the acquisition background and objectives, there's further clarification and guidance on 3 components, and it's the statement of need, life cycle cost, and acquisition streamlining, right? Most of these give more clarification on things that are for major systems acquisitions, certainly because the threshold that actually triggers the acquisition plan. But the statement of need would, add information specifically about acquisition decision documents and milestone decision reviews or service reviews if they're needed or appropriate. It would talk about the date of approval for operational use and some program items that have to have that particular component of it, or if waivers are involved, when they were requested, and information as detailed as that. And so it also requires like a milestone decision chart that would be constructed in there. So it can get quite detailed in the statement of need, but some of the requirements by the DoD is very detailed, so it makes a lot of sense to do that. The life cycle cost and acquisition streamlining kind of are related more to the major defense acquisition type of big A acquisition, as you hear some folks talk about. Big A acquisition is sometimes used as the term to refer to major systems acquisition. Little A acquisition is something outside of that, which is just buying, goods and services to support let's say, base operations or things such as that. But as you can see here in the PGI, it talks about modifying the acquisition background and objectives in those three particular areas. Now, the second major component of an acquisition plan is the plan of action. And so it's got more guidance on the plan of action, of course, in competition, where it wants you to address, like, the Deputy Undersecretary for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, and his guidelines for creating a competitive environment for goods and services, in the competition phase of it. It's got, budgeting and funding, the line item stuff that's required. Certainly in major programs, you're already, you have budgeted and you have money that's available for it. All that information needs to be in there. Logistics concerns and considerations, and energy and environmental considerations. There's specific information that has to be put in there and related to that. And as you can imagine, in other considerations, they're dealing with many things like, acquiring things and planning for crisis situations, and how to do it much faster, and how to maintain it, and how to, contract for theater security cooperation efforts. And so I just share that level of detail with you, just because I just wanted to let you know that, hey, there's a lot of detail that kind of would go into a acquisition plan, a written acquisition plan that's required by the DFAR, that is in addition to what would be required by the FAR. Next slide. So the next subpart in the DFARS is subpart 207.3, and it talks about contractor versus government performance. And so this has to do with a moratorium on and restrictions on the public-private competitions that were discussed in more detail anyway at Office of Management and Budget Circular A76. And so A76 talks about a circumstance where you should be able to do competitions or studies, they also call them, where you can decide whether or not it's cost efficient or better for government employees to do something, or contract employees. And so I think it was in 2010, there was a moratorium on being able to fund those studies. And so in effect, for the last decade, that they haven't been allowed. And so the notion of actually replacing government employees with contract workers has kind of been on hold and frozen. And so there's a lot more information, a lot more to this in OMB A76 circular that you'd want to refer to, but certainly it would be something that you would want to consider in your acquisition plan if the requirement you receive certainly started talking about manning folks in a way that seems to be replacing or supplanting government employees. Next slide. The next subpart is subpart 207.4, which gives guidance on lease versus purchase, the cost benefit analysis. And so this is all about the notion that there's a certain point in time in the acquisition of a lease that the lease becomes more expensive than actually purchasing and maintaining the equipment. And so there's guidance in here on that particular topic that would require you to do that cost benefit analysis to figure out what's going on. It also requires authorization for certain things. If you're buying combat vehicles or vessels, as defined by the FAR and statute, more military centric type things like the vessels, aircraft, and combat vehicles, where it requires the Secretary of the Service to make certain statutory determinations before that happens. And that makes a lot of sense. Most of these things are programmed in major defense acquisitions, and so you don't want to contract for it outside of that. Certainly that would be one reason why it would be in there, and this kind of limitation would be there. Also, there's a limitation on contracts with terms of 18 months or more, and this has to do with limitations on non-severable service contracts, 10 USA 2410 Alpha, and a little bit of limitations on leasing commercial vehicles. There's a section also within the DFARS 207-471 that talks about making sure that you use the right type of funds for the right type of lease. There are two types of leases. There's capital leases and operational leases. You know, for equipment, and capital leases is where you're like on an installment plan to buy the thing. If you're doing that, then you got to use a certain type of funds or appropriated funds, and that's procurement funds. And if it's an operational lease, you should be using operational funds. Next slide. Subpart 207.5 talks about inherently governmental functions, and this you usually run across. We used to run across it a lot, actually, deployed, because they, you know, there's limitation on how many troops you can kind of have in theater, and so as you're doing your acquisition planning, you're planning for people to actually perform whatever it is that they're doing in theater. There's always a worry that you know, you're trying to contract for inherently governmental functions, because, you know, obviously in theater or in a you know, in Afghanistan or in the you know, in that particular theater of operations, you run into a lot of military operations, because that's what de facto it is. But anyway, inherently governmental functions are defined in various places. Certainly in the A76 circular, which I talked about a little bit earlier, it talks about it in detail there. The definition I have in front of you right here is from the FAR 2.101, which it talks about inherently governmental activity and how they include, you know, some sort of requirement of an exercise of discretion in applying government authority, right? And so that is the theme of how I think about inherently governmental functions all the time. And I can't help but envision like a judge sitting in front of a jury trying to decide who goes to jail and who's not. That seems like the most governmental thing in the world to me for some reason, and it's a pretty good indicator of what this is talking about. Certainly it's that discretionary exercise of discretion that would be prohibited. And so you're prohibited from contracting for inherently governmental functions. And next slide. The FAR also gives some examples of what is and what is not, because there's always that description of an activity that seems to kind of straddle the line of an inherently governmental function. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's pretty good. You know, if inherently governmental function is one of those things where you're binding the United States to take or not take some sort of action by contract policy or regulation, makes sense, right? Determine, protect, and advance United States economic and political interests. You know, seems diplomatic, right? Diplomatic stuff shouldn't be contracted out. Significantly affecting, this is my judge example, affecting the life, liberty, property of private persons, right? And so that's the one I always envisioned. Or exerting ultimate control over an acquisition, you know, deciding how we're going to spend or what requirements are for the government. That seems like another thing that would be inherently governmental, and that's absolutely right. So it also talks about some things that do not normally include being described as inherently governmental, and those are things like gathering advice and opinions and recommendations and things like that to give to a decision maker that is in an inherently governmental role or performing that function. And so there's a little bit of guidance on what is and what is not inherently governmental, but certainly that's in there. Next slide. There are some exceptions for those activities that are closely associated with inherently governmental functions that I wanted to mention here. You know, you have to, by policy, say that, hey, none of the functions being performed in a contract are inherently governmental, but you can, under some limited conditions, be able to contract for things that are closely associated with inherently governmental activities. And so, you know, if a contracting officer determines that DoD personnel can't reasonably do the function and they're not available, that they'll have enough oversight or that all the inherently governmental functions will be performed by the DoD, then they can kind of proceed with contracting for somebody to assist them so that are closely associated with it. So that becomes kind of an important sticking point there, and that's where you get a lot of your consultants and data analysis and stuff like that that are closely associated with the folks ultimately making the decision. And certainly there's some guidance on being able to utilize that in here in section 207.503. Next slide. This last subpart in the DFARS talks about buy-in to budget. It talks about, essentially it's buying additional quantities of some sort of end item that you had specific authority, probably some sort of authority from the Appropriations Act or the Authorization Act to go out and acquire something, right? And so in many end items and sometimes line items specifically within these authorities, it'll talk about buying a certain quantity of an end item and in an amount. And so this is authority that allows you to actually buy something, providing for the funding of that acquisition if the agency head determines that we still need the thing, the requirement for the end item is expected to remain the same. If it's possible to acquire the higher quantity of item without additional funding, right? So that's the statutory amount or the amount by the Appropriation Act or the Authorization Act that says, hey, this is how much you get in there, or the Appropriation Act that tells you this is how much you have in there. And that if you are getting these end items, that it will not exceed that amount in law, and the quality of that particular product is not going to degrade. So it'd be a fully functioning and usable end item. And so that makes a lot of sense. If you can buy more of them and you really need them, and you're not, sacrificing some sort of quality to get the more numbers, then having a little bit of authority to be able to acquire things and some guidance on that makes a lot of sense. Next slide. So that being said, this was a short overview over the DFARS Part 207 that talks about how the DoD looks at some of the issues that are involved with their DoD planning, like inherently governmental activities and whether they're going to lease or purchase, or how they're going to put together the overall written plan for acquisitions and hopefully execute those things. Again, my name is Alan Apple from the law firm of Ward & Berry in Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C. I sure appreciate you joining us today, and I hope that you have a better understanding of the Defense Acquisition Regulation Supplement 207, and for that matter, FAR Part 7 acquisition planning. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the subject that I'm talking about, of course, or any other GovCon-related issue, and I can be reached at alan@wardandberry.com. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alan, for a great presentation and for sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. The recording will be on our website and YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. And please join us next week as we cover more of the DFARS parts.